Hi, I'm Philidor,
And I'm Clara,
and this is a sheep staring at me.
a podcast on history, culture, literature.
Geeky things and life in general. And today we're going to talk about the Romantics versus the Metaphysicals. Clara, do you want to?
Well, yeah, maybe it's easier for me to start because the metaphysicals came first.
But it's poetry we're talking
It's
about.
poetry. Well, if anyone's thinking now, what in blazes name are they talking about? What are the metaphysical poets? That was me when I heard about them first.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah. Well, metaphysical poets are a group of poets in Britain in the 17th century. What I realized about them is more or less everybody who has delved into British poetry will have heard about one or two of them, but maybe won't have known them under the name metaphysical. And that is mainly because metaphysical poets isn't such a fixed term as I think romantic poets is. The metaphysic, yeah, I mean, the romantics probably weren't writing as romantic poets either, and the
Well, no,
metaphysical
it's not a fixed term. I mean, it's a fixed term, but it's also a broad thing. So yeah.
But with the metaphysical poets, opinions differ. There are a couple of people that scholars agree on. It's basically not a fixed term, and the canon is tricky. But what can be said is that they didn't write as metaphysicals, and the term was coined later by Samuel Johnson and John Dryden. And what can be agreed on that metaphysical poetry is a certain genre of poetry that arose as a reaction to Elizabethan poetry. And one big thing they did was use a lot of conceits. That is the big word that always pops up when talking about metaphysical poetry. So that is the main thing I'm going to mention here to make clear what is it that sets metaphysical poetry apart from other poetry, perhaps. So conceits as in exaggerated comparisons and inventive, complex metaphors and puns. That is what the metaphysicals went for, but not in a, well, let's say, pompous way as Shakespeare did it, but in a very everyday way. But it was still outrageous. It wasn't outrageous because they compared women's eyes to flowers, but it was outrageous because, for example, they compared the blood that a flea had sucked from a man and woman to their sexual union. And that is
Sexual union outside of marriage.
exactly.
That's the big point, I think. Not the sexual union bit. They did that before, but
They did that before, but with the metaphysicals, they took one thing, they took A, they took B, A and B didn't have anything together with each other, but they made it happen somehow. So it is a clever form of writing in a more ordinary speech than the Elizabethans did, but that doesn't mean it's easy. It's
but
very
it's still
complex.
very, very condensed, I find.
It is, yeah.
And
Yeah.
and compared especially to the romantics, the metaphysicals, I think, are very, very conscious of form. I mean, the romantics usually are too, but I mean, a bit concerned about the form of stuff, but not like the metaphysicals. I mean, I think there's a poem that looks like wings, and it's about flying.
George Herbert.
Yeah, and it just, I mean, the romantics didn't do stuff like that.
Even apart from that, I have the feeling, and I didn't get this from a book, that is my personal feeling, that the metaphysicals saw poetry more like a puzzle. And they had this form that they wanted to achieve and basically prove that they were really good at writing.
Yeah. And they didn't
it
want
was a very
to.
analytical way of composing, maybe. I can't say that for every one of them. I mean, who am I to judge how they wrote?
And I think they didn't want to publish a lot of it. They just wanted to publish one tome of literature or poetry in their life, and that was it. And preferably after their death.
Yeah, a lot of it wasn't published until they died. Some had agreed on that with other people, that their poetry would be published after they died. Mostly their work was circulated in the private sphere.
Yeah. And the Romantics are the exact opposite. The Romantics made money from it. They wanted to make money from it. They wanted to produce as much poetry as they could.
Yeah.
And other than the metaphysicals, they were about they probably were more about surviving than about anything else in the first moment. But they did do it out of a feeling. They kind of wanted it to seem like it was, like they had a feeling and they wrote it down. And when you read it, it feels that way. And if it's about, I don't know, a sunny day, then it should feel like a sunny day.
Yeah. I mean, that goes along with what I know of Wordsworth. Isn't he quoted with saying that poetry is a spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings?
Oh dear, yes, it is. But where he has, he had said that, but in some way, but it was still, I mean, poetry is always the performer's art.
Yeah.
I think if you're not a performer, if you don't like to be listened to, you won't write poetry. I mean, we both write poetry.
Yeah.
And we do a podcast. We obviously like to be listened to. So yeah, I think, Wordsworth liked to wax poetically, but at the end of the day, if he didn't have enough money to eat, he probably was more bothered about that than a good poem. I don't know.
I think so, yes. Yeah, this is just the one thing that is always quoted of Wordsworth.
I know. I had a whole discussion about that the other day. So yeah.
Yeah, and the metaphysicals, they didn't rely on their poetry that much. Poetry was their side job. I have a feeling.
Yeah, but they also usually didn't really. I mean, not most of them, or a lot of them, actually were gentlemen, weren't they?
Exactly. Yeah, most of them were gentlemen.
Donne wasn't.
But half stayed aristocratic their whole life and was in. Well, some of them were in parliament. Some of them were gentlemen. Some of them were priests. Some of them, all or some of those things. So yeah.
I mean, I think the one I just mentioned, Donne, is I think the most famous.
He is.
I know.
He is, I think, also the earliest. So what we have to see here with the metaphysicals is that they intersect with Shakespeare. Donne was born in 1572, died in 1631, so died very early in the 17th century. I mean, Shakespeare had been dead for 10, 20 years when Donne died, so they were contemporaries, but they wrote very differently. And Donne was, well, I'd say he was the first of the metaphysicals, because he was also the one that that Samuel Johnson referred to when he said, when he mentioned the term metaphysical the first time. And interestingly enough, metaphysical wasn't meant as a compliment.
Neither was romantic, actually.
Yeah. So it was meant derisively, and obviously John Donne didn't say, "Hello, I'm a metaphysical poet." He just wrote poetry, and later people called him metaphysical, and other people that followed Donne too.
Yeah, but on Donne, I actually there is a sort of poem on Donne's poetry, by Coleridge. And this was the inspiration for this. Yeah. Else we probably wouldn't have connected the two. But to Coleridge, one should know that he and Wordsworth were the founders of the Romantic movement in England. So he was one of the first to, bring out that kind of stuff. And he was a very good friend of Wordsworth as well. And he was a member of the Lake Poets, and he collaborated with a lot of very famous people from his time as well. And he said about Donne's poetry, with Donne, whose muse on dromedary trots, wraith iron pokers into true love knots, rhyme sturdy cripple, fancy's maze and clue, wits forge and fire blast, meanings press and screw. Which
meanings press and screw, that is a very nice line, because they're both, what I find funny about it, and I don't know if Coleridge meant this, but they screw literally, as in they are screwed and intertwisted, but you're laughing, you know what I'm getting at. Donne also writes a lot about sex, and what is another word for having sex? Screw.
And spiritual stuff about that. And basically what Coleridge did here was he used the sort of the metaphysical kind of style to write something to say, yeah, you're shit. Guys, just nah. And we had the course on Donne and the other metaphysicals, and we did, I don't know how many weeks on Donne. It was a lot. And we were complete. I mean, it was more than the others. And it was, I mean, my comment to that was just, I'm undone now. And that's a comment that he brought too.
Yeah, he would have liked that.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, I agreed with Coleridge when we had to read Donne. It was just so much.
Yeah.
So do you want to introduce some of the metaphysicals very quickly? Because
let's quickly go over them. As I said, it's not fixed to exactly the metaphysicals were. Generally, one can agree on a couple. Well, one thing I have to add is that the term metaphysical was coined by Johnson in a work called Life of Cowley. Abraham Cowley is also called one of the metaphysicals. I will not mention him a lot because, frankly, no, I don't like his poetry that much. Interesting, but to me it sounds dry. I'll start with John Donne, because I also think he's one of the names that a lot of people recognize, albeit not always under the term metaphysical. So he is, I would say, the most famous of the metaphysicals, and published, well, actually not published, circulated poems such as The Flea, A Valediction Forbidding Mourning, just in case that means anything to you.
I mean, to me it means something, but
yeah,
I don't know to whom else.
it was one of those poems where I thought, oh, you have heard the title somewhere, but I have never read it before. Well, I've read it now, but
yeah,
at the time where I heard about Donne first, it's one of those faint recollections. Well, his main work was called Holy Sonnets, which was a collection of sonnets published posthumously and circulated in manuscripts before. And in those, he wrote about the psychological realism of love, sexuality, the complexity of life, and notably also platonic love, not only romantic and sexual love, but platonic love. And generally speaking, he focused on themes of faith in God and women. And he had for the time a revolutionary diction and language, because he was the first after the Elizabethans who used this metaphysical way of writing. Yeah, he was critical of the society in earlier poetry, used his striking imagery and the sophistication for being critical. And yeah, to me, it always sounded quite dense. So when we say that the metaphysicals used ordinary speech, it's not to be confused with being easy.
It's ordinary speech in comparison to things that had done before in poetry.
Exactly.
Yeah. It's not
Yeah.
ordinary speech as we would read it now. Neither is it with the Romantics, or any poetry, really.
Yeah. Well, other poets that can be counted under metaphysical are, for example, Andrew Marvell and George Herbert. There are more, but let's not overcomplicate matters. You mentioned Easter Wings, the poem that is arranged in the form of wings, and that is by George Herbert. He was known for publishing visually pleasing poetry. For example, those Easter wings. And what I find interesting about him is that he was known for being a kind person. I find it extraordinary because we're talking about things 400 years ago. And if you can manage to be known as a nice person 400 years after, you must have been really nice. Or you must have had friends who published things about you. Maybe he had both. Henry Vaughan, another metaphysical poet, said about George Herbert that he was a most glorious saint and seer. He was known for caring for his parish. He was a priest. Well, after he sat in Parliament. First he started to become a priest, then he interrupted that, sat in Parliament, then he became a priest. And as a priest, he was known for deeply caring for his parish and providing the sacraments to the people and food and clothing with the utmost care, apparently. I just find that a very interesting detail, that he was known for being nice to people.
There's worse things.
There's worse things. We're also talking about the era of the English Civil War and Restoration, so maybe you didn't have to be that kind to be known.
Yeah, it's better than some others.
Yeah.
I'm going to get into that in a moment.
Yeah. Well, let's quickly close my monologue with Andrew Marvell. He also sat in the House of Commons. He wrote poems such as The Love Song to His Coy Mistress, another one of those titles that I had read somewhere before I knew.
Yeah, I remember that too.
Who it was from. But he also wrote political addresses, and he was the son of a Church of England clergyman, so he was also one of those that had a very deeply religious background. And his first poems were in Latin and Greek. I haven't read his poems in Latin and Greek.
I can't even read Latin and Greek.
Well, yeah, I didn't want to say like that. Latin and Greek. And yeah, I mentioned the English Civil War here, and he had a more or less turbulent time with that. Well, I said all people at the time, but he was a royalist at first. I think he even wrote a poem about the king and queen's child being born, which must have been the later Charles II. So he was a royalist, but then he sympathized with the interregnum regime. Charles I was beheaded in 1649, and after that, Oliver Cromwell reigned. And this period is called the interregnum. And Andrew Marvell sympathized with the changing regimes during the interregnum eventually. But he barely avoided punishment after the Restoration, because monarchy was restored, and well, they punished people. Eventually, they just punished the ones that had signed the death warrant, but by death. They only punished those by death. You still have to be careful. But he avoided punishment after the Restoration, and he also convinced Charles II's government not to execute John Milton. He was very close to John Milton. He was his assistant because John Milton had gone blind, and Andrew Marvell, assisted John Milton not only in his writings but also in not getting executed.
Very nice. Well, I think I'll take over now, because else you'll go on talking.
Oh, I won't. I have nothing more to add.
I mean, you never know. Well, I did mention Coleridge before, and yeah, so I'm not going to repeat that again. But Wordsworth, well, he and Coleridge did found the Romantic movement in Britain. Wordsworth lived from 1770 to 1850. So he was quite old, and Coleridge and Wordsworth's sister, Dorothy Wordsworth, well, she wasn't known as a Romantic poet, but she should be known as a Romantic poet because she wrote. And she was really good, and they were known as the first wave poets, sort of, or are known as the first wave poets, because they were the first to do this. They were the so-called lake poets. So Wordsworth had a house in the Lake District, I think, and they took walks there a lot, which we know from his sister Dorothy's diaries and so on, and accounts and letters and so on. And Wordsworth is probably best known for his poem "I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud," which I'm not going to read out now, but yeah. And then his sister Dorothy, as I have mentioned, she was a poet in her own right, and a writer and a diarist, and she was a year younger, and she died in 1855, so she was quite old as well. And she was very close with her brother, and she was also always there when the lake poets met there and went for walks, and she wrote stuff herself and was quite influenced by that herself. And then there is the so-called second wave of the poets. The first wave was very much into the movement of the French Revolution that was going on right then, when they were young men, younger than us now. Well, they were very into that and very interested by that. And the second group of them was born Byron was born in 1788, so he was barely a toddler when the French Revolution started, and he was also a royal, so I mean, he probably didn't, I mean, he wasn't royal, he was noble, but you know, he didn't really want that kind of stuff to happen. I mean, he couldn't have, because, well, I would have been stupid. Anyway, and then Shelley, Keats, and Mary Shelley were all born in the 90s of the 1700s. So they were born after the French Revolution had happened. And I mean, it was still sort of going on, but they didn't really, I mean, they grew up with it, with the knowledge of it, and they were very political. Yes, and Mary Shelley's parents were both writers and both very political and very influential people, and also very much revolutionaries. So, yeah. anyway, all of them were known for writing in a certain way in which they preferred the feeling to the form. They, or rather told people they preferred the feeling to the form. And while they did write poetry, Byron, Polidori, and Mary Shelley did end up writing, are they novels? Is Frankenstein a novel? Yeah, well, then they wrote very famous novels. And Polidori was the vampire, I think.
I don't know them.
I mean, Polidori was Lord Byron's personal doctor, I think, and also a good friend. And in 1816, there was the year without a summer.
Yeah.
Because was it the Krakatoa that had erupted?
So.
And so there was an ash cloud so bad in the air. Well, it wasn't a problem for the people. Technically, they could breathe fine, but the Krakatoa, when it erupted, apparently that was such a loud boom that you could hear it miles away, hundreds of miles away. So that was a, big deal. And the ash made sure that there wasn't really a summer. And so it was cold. They were in Switzerland and in a house, and Byron, Mary Shelley, and Polidori were, basically sitting there, and it was cold and rainy and ugh. And then they started writing ghost stories. And that's what we know them for as well. So they didn't just write really lovely, sort of romantic wasn't a thing, not the romantic thing from now. So that's, I think, what I've tried to say.
Yeah. And also it's romantic with a capital R.
Yes. Oh, yes.
With the romantics, it's very easy to get confused with everyday language, saying romantic. I mean, because you can literally be a romantic. If you are literally metaphysical, you have a problem.
Yeah, true. But and you said that, who was it? Herbert was known for being a nice guy, basically.
Yes.
Well, Lord Byron was known for shagging his sister, so.
Oh dear.
That's not a good thing. That's why he was in Switzerland in the first place. So yeah, I mean, they were also advocates of free love, which is not a bad idea, but in that time, kind of a bad idea.
You can take it a bit too far with the free love.
I mean, yeah. Anyway, so we did write down a bunch of questions for one another.
Yes.
And before we talk, I don't know how long again, we should do that now.
Shall I start with one observation I made that may influence our questions?
Oh, do that.
Because you mentioned that we both write poetry, and the realization I thought I had was that you write, at least it seems to me, you write sort of like a romantic poet. I write more like a metaphysical poet. Of course, this is a generalization. We can't fit perfectly into the puzzle. They themselves didn't fit perfectly always. But I have a feeling that not necessarily how the poetry looks, but how we write.
Oh, yeah.
I think you have this spontaneous outflow. You have a thought, you have emotions, you write it down and it is a poem. Yeah. I have a thought and I think, in what kind of rhyme could I put that?
And I don't even use rhymes that much. I mean, I do use
and I
them,
always use rhymes, and I think, oh yeah, these rhymes I'm going to use. And that doesn't mean that my poetry is not emotional. That doesn't mean that yours doesn't have a nice form, but that means that is the first thing we latch onto, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I know I was inspired by the Romantics to even start writing.
Yeah. And I know I was inspired by Shakespeare and probably the guys who came later.
Yeah, so
I literally see it as a puzzle when I write.
I don't. I see it as my feelings need to get out. I can't contain them. I need to write them down because otherwise I'm just going to explode. And
I see it as I need to complete this puzzle to put my feelings into it.
yeah, but I mean, I'm also a person with severe anger management problems, which you wouldn't think, I think, but I'm also clumsy.
I once wrote a very spontaneous poem. My only romantic poem was written when there was a big storm at university, and I was stuck there with my best friend Hannah. Shout out to Hannah. And I was so angry that I wrote a poem. And it's a 2-page thing. And I even used an expletive.
Was that by any chance in the summer term 2018, this storm?
Probably.
Because I had a course with Mr. Dow, a very, very favorite, very much favorite lecturer. And we were reading Macbeth.
Oh, that's nice.
And we were reading the very first scene in pairs of 3. And my group was a bit, well, we were later, we had started later and the windows were all open and there was a storm brewing. And we were reading these verses and suddenly, you know, we were reading these verses out loud, the 3 of us together. Suddenly there was a very big wind and thunder and lightning and we were like, okay. So yeah. Okay, the questions. Who would we like to have tea with from the metaphysicals or romantics? I mean, I think you're going to answer about the metaphysicals and I'm going to answer about the romantics, but yeah.
I'll try to. I honestly wasn't too sure about that. Because I honestly don't know if my interests would meet their interests much. I'm not that big of a clergy person. I'm also not that much of a government person. Poetry is one of my interests, so I would probably get along with them.
Or you wouldn't because you're a woman.
One can always choose Donne. But I don't know. If I had to choose between the 3 I mentioned, I would probably choose Herbert because he was allegedly known for being such a nice guy, and I can't fathom that. And I don't know if we would talk about their poetry, that could become a pressure point.
Well, I think I probably would choose John Keats. I mean, to have tea with, because I mean, I personally don't know that much about Keats. Keats died at age 25. So, you know, we don't know how he would have become as a writer and as a person, or what he would have done. But I've read some of his poetry and I've seen a film about him and I've read a bit about him as well. And he just seems, in the way he's portrayed or written about or writes himself, he seems to be very similar to me. I mean, that's a feeling I have. He seems to be someone who doesn't understand feeling. He doesn't understand people, and he needs to write. He doesn't really care about marketing anything. And yeah, so that's how I feel about it. I don't even know if that's a completely true thing, but it's a true feeling, which is a very big deal for the romantics.
I get what you mean, though. Yeah, I don't know too much about the romantics, but well,
I mean, also one person I wouldn't mind hanging out with would probably be Dorothy Wordsworth, because a woman writer is always it's always interesting to talk to someone from a time where that wasn't really normal.
Probably, yeah.
And yeah. Also, she isn't mentioned anywhere unless it's like letters or something by her brother. She's never really mentioned in history books.
So that would be a reason to have tea with her and talk about stuff.
Because yeah, she probably knew a lot of stuff. So yeah.
Yeah. One addition I have is that I would probably realistically settle on Andrew Marvell, not Donne or Herbert. I know I've gone through all three I've mentioned, but I remember that he was a tutor to a lot of people.
Yeah, then.
And I mean, yeah, teachers. And he seems like an interesting person. I don't know if any of them was particularly nice, apart from Herbert, maybe.
I mean,
but
Herbert could have been a right ass.
he could have been.
He might have been a
disappointment. I
mean,
can't go for the nicest guy and be disappointed because he's an ass. So I go for Andrew Marvell, who had an interesting life, and I can ask him about that.
Well, at least that, yeah. What I did write down as, I think, the last question that we didn't really talk about yet. Well, we did talk about it partly. Which of the romantic / metaphysicals would like us? Whom would we like, and why?
I think Donne would tear me to pieces poetically.
Yeah, but also we did say to talk about the other. So basically, I agree with you. Donne would probably tear you to pieces. I don't know if Herbert wasn't a misogynistic ass, he probably, and he was nice. I mean,
and
he probably would.
And very devotional.
Yeah, well, doesn't always have to be a good thing.
Yeah, but it could always sound nice and still be mean.
Yeah. Who do you think would like me from the romantics?
Well, if I say Lord Byron, that doesn't mean anything.
Lord Byron, I think he liked pretty much anyone.
Exactly.
Who'd look up to him, but I don't really look up to him.
So maybe he would be intrigued by you because you wouldn't look up at him.
I mean, Mary Shelley, I think she didn't really look up to him that much either, and they became really good friends. So because she did, I mean, he had a shit handwriting, so she had to copy his work before sending it to his publisher. So they couldn't have hated each other that much. But I think Byron is also, I mean, he shagged anyone, honestly.
Yeah.
He had so many kids out of marriage. It's genuinely, but he looked after all of them if he could. And, you know, that's not too shitty a thing. But again, I don't know if I would, nah.
Yeah, I think John Keats would probably like you. I'm not an expert by any means on Keats, but
Neither am I.
yeah, I have heard that he was, well, that maybe he knew he was going to die. And he was very reflected and sensible or sensitive. And you said earlier that you felt similar to him, so he might have latched onto that and seen something similar in you. And
also he was surrounded by death the whole time. I think I don't know if he was his younger brother, but I think his younger brother died in his care.
Yeah.
So, and I mean, I've seen a lot of death in the last 2 years, so that might have been
something similar there.
Yeah. So, I mean, yeah.
I mean, let's all assume they would drink tea.
They probably would.
They probably would.
Yeah. Okay. I think actually we're at about 40 minutes now. And if we go on talking, we're never going to stop. So
if we don't talk, we'll become metaphysicals. So
oh dear. I mean, I do think that the Romantics, I mean, they did similar things. They exchanged poetry, and but what they did was also they performed poetry in front of each other. They would, I don't know, meet up, and then they would just perform. And I mean, we do that sometimes, don't we?
yeah.
Yeah. Okay. A thought that I had earlier that I do need to say, because I don't know. I did say that I didn't really look up to Byron. I do not really look up to Byron because I think, as a writer myself, I cannot really admire someone else who's a writer. And that's something I think Hemingway would applaud this. Anyway, I don't think I can really look up to someone else like that who's a writer. I can say, yeah, it's a good style. I like this. I don't, I like reading it, but I can't say I look up to this. I want to be this. I don't.
I sort of get what you mean. Although I have been in the other direction sometimes, that I read a poem and I think, oh, I don't particularly like this, but then I find a stylistic device that is really clever, and I think, oh, that's nice of you. Well done, you. Well done, John. And then I remember that it's one of the one of the best known poets I'm talking to in my head, and I'm not their teacher, but yeah.
But you're going to become a teacher, so
Yeah.
anyways,
I wouldn't say I admire them, but and that's why I get what you mean.
So I would say that's that from us for this time. And
talk to you in a fortnight.
Yeah, probably. Yeah. I mean, uni has started. So yeah. Have a good 2 weeks or whatever or 5 minutes or whenever you're going to listen to this or to the other thing or whatever.
The future.
Yeah. See you in the future.
Until the future.